Hello, Phil Craig. Thank you for agreeing to come back on the show again as our UK correspondent.
Oh, is that what I am now? How exciting. It's a pleasure to be back.
It's like Meghan Markle. She just announces things and then you're stuck in it.
Yeah. I see myself. I think we have a lot in common, actually, but we should maybe talk about that another day.
Yes, exactly. I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to pick your brain because you very kindly left a very nice comment on my last Gossip Before Bed saying that I wasn't a dinosaur. And I appreciated that because, Phil, I got to tell you, I feel like I've gone to sleep, had a nightmare and woken up sort of on the side of the debate I never expected to be on. Back in 2013, when Julia Gillard became our Prime Minister, I was cheering the fact that we had our first female Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. When she added the gender identity section to the Sexual Discrimination Act, I was thinking, great, fantastic, because, working in this industry and me as a singer, you have a lot of friends that are gay and that you support and love. And so I'm thinking, well, that's great. Everything's going in the right direction. And it never occurred to me that there would be a downside. And the downside has hit me in the face. And that's what I want to discuss with you today. So could you actually, before we get into it, what you think, I just want to, for everyone that's watching that is not familiar with the story, because I'm amazed how many are not in Australia, Roxanne Tickle is a transgender woman who sued a woman's only social media app, and she claimed that she was allegedly discriminated against because she was refused access to this app on the basis of her gender identity. Now, it's since been found by Justice Robert Bromwich that she was indirectly discriminated against, and I'll get into that legal term in a sec, and also that sex is changeable, non-binary, and that the concept of sex has broadened over the last 30 years since the establishment of the Sexual Discrimination Act. So they're the facts of the matter. Mm-hmm. But I want to ask you, Phil, what's your just very brief overview? Don't tell us too much because I'm going to really get into picking your brain about this issue, but what's your general take?
Well, I think we've all been on a strange journey on this issue, Shauna, and mine is probably a little bit like yours. I've worked with, in Australia and in Britain, worked with and known trans people, many gay friends as well, but I've known several trans people. I'm absolutely in no doubt trans people exist. They need their rights protecting. They need specific healthcare. I've seen people who've had the most radical treatments, drugs, surgery, and I've seen how their lives have improved dramatically. So that's where I began my interest in this subject. But I also friends of people who began to see a problem with what you might call trans extremism, or the more radical end of the trans rights movement. One of them was my friend Malcolm Clark. I know we're going to talk about him later. And I think what we've seen is something that worked for adults, like the people I knew, but when it became applied to children, especially children who are perhaps caught up in a social media moment, it became very, very complex and difficult. And then, of course, everybody got very angry because that's what we do now. And everybody got in their trenches. And sometimes things that were time-honored safeguarding procedures or just good old common sense around things like healthcare of children or talking about suicide, all of that got thrown out. It was suddenly, you're hating. It's a phobia. And there's a real fear to speak out, which is why I think people like Malcolm were actually very brave in doing what they did.
Yes, indeed. And I do want to get into what he has actually written recently in his Substack because it was so insightful and really makes you think. Now, I wanted to explain about what indirect gender identity discrimination was as defined by the law. It's when there's a requirement or practice that is the same for everyone but has an unfair effect on people of a particular gender identity. And so Roxanne Tickle was affected because Sal Grover wanted to have her app to be, she would say, biologically women only, or she would say women only. And the trans sort of, take on that would be, well, we are women, so we deserve access. But unfortunately, also even lesbian action groups have come out and said that if you have a male-bodied trans woman in our space, it causes a lot of trauma. And there is actually at the tribunal right now, as we're recording this, and luckily we don't have the verdict, But the Lesbian Action Group is actually taking the Human Rights Commission to task and hoping for an exemption so they can actually have lesbian events where people are cisgendered. And I know a lot of people on this channel really object to that term, but I'm speaking as in using phrases that are accepted, by the legal profession around this issue. So do you think it is scary that women can't convene, biological women can't convene without a trans woman, maybe a male-bodied trans woman, that it's illegal to exclude them? Do you think that is bad?
I think this is a uniquely Australian phenomenon. I mean, the idea that a judge can say that sex is changeable, I think that's quite. I don't think that's happened before. I think it's unprecedented. A lot of these cases have come to court. A lot of these arguments about the boundaries between women's rights and trans people's rights, because that's what this issue is really about. By extending the rights of trans people, which many of us would support, are there moments when that impinges on other hard-won rights, especially of women's? And that's why in Britain, especially, a lot of long-standing feminist and lesbian campaigners have found themselves siding more with the J.K. Rowling view of the world than perhaps the trans activist view of the world. So I think when a group of women get together and say, for example, and this is what happened in Scotland, we really do not want male-bodied men in our prisons, especially if they've literally raped a woman. And that became a huge issue here. And it literally brought down the government of Scotland, especially when J.K. Rowling got involved. I think that's a very good example. The giggle tickle one is perhaps more arguable. I don't know it as much detail as you, but the idea that a man who's never shown any interest in the trans movement can suddenly say, "Oh, I'm going to prison. Right, I'm a woman now," especially a man who's raped somebody. I mean, that was so offensive. And yet, even then, the people who tried to make the case, women's rights activists, and I know some of them personally, got horrific abuse. "Oh, you're a phobe. You're hating. You're trying to divide everybody." And I think that's one of the big problems here, is that we do just jump into our trenches on this issue, especially on this issue.
And I think it's because too, like you said, I think you made a really good distinction when we first started talking, when you said about sort of trans extremists. We've all seen them on TikTok and X and everything, where they've been quite abusive. I don't think they're representative of the general transgender population necessarily, but they're, someone has a very strident, hostile, aggressive view, and they have these very authoritarian sort of dictates, and I think that's what scares people. The story, I'm sure you know the story of Kathleen Stock, the British academic who was driven out of her job by kind of howling mobs of people in masks, waving burning fireworks, putting up the most horrible posters. And whatever you think about Kathleen Stock's work, I don't think she deserved that. And there was a famous story at the Wee Spa in Los Angeles. Do you remember that a couple of years ago? Some women complained that they'd seen a trans woman, they thought, kind of perving on their children in this spa. And they'd complained. And this became a cause célèbre for a couple of days. And a lot of people rushed down there, including Antifa-type people, Black Bloc people. And they were screaming at these women, calling them Nazis and fascists. And it turned out that, guess what? This person who they were worried about had a long history of, doing this kind of thing. Right. So it wasn't some kind of like blameless trans woman who was being picked on. It was a genuine safeguarding issue. And I think that's often been the case, as with the prisons in Scotland, as with, I think, in the Tavistock clinic. Yeah.
People try to blow the whistle, and many of the people at the Tavistock, I know we'll come to that later, they were gay themselves, they were trans themselves. But they tried to speak to journalists about their fears that they were maybe rushing ahead sometimes with these very young girls into the sort of puberty-blocking surgical route. And suddenly, even though they had a long history in the movement, they were out. They were evil. They were wrong. And that issue, that approach to debate, which I think is so characteristic of our time, has really kind of, undermined any chance of a reasonable debate on this issue, especially this issue, in the last 3 or 4 years.
Shutting down debate. I wanted to read a quote for everyone from Paula Gerber, Professor of Law at Monash University. And she actually welcomed the Tickle Vs Giggle judgment, saying it made it clear cut that you cannot have spaces designated as women only where what you mean is cisgender only. And that made me wonder, well, that if that is the case, is it too melodramatic to suggest that that might actually mean that women who want to have, just biological women from birth spaces, that they would be pushed underground in order to not, have to endure discrimination cases? Who knows, maybe it will come about that it will be illegal. Like in Germany, if you misgender someone, those podcasters who misgendered someone recently, $250,000 fine and possibly up to 20 years jail, it was reported. Now, that's a way to shut down debate, isn't it? Because if you make people very fearful, they're going to go underground. And then Feminist Legal Clinic Principal Solicitor Anna Kerr said, it is clear now that discrimination laws intended to protect women are now preventing them from having safe spaces to meet. So there's this paradox there where we're losing rights. And could we say we're losing the right to freely associate? Is it a freedom of association issue?
Well, I think it probably is. And I think these cases are probably quite rare. The Giggle Tickle case, for example, this trans woman clearly was looking for a fight, wanted to make a point, didn't like the fact that this had been advertised as a biological women-only app and thought that that was wrong and that was discriminatory. Whereas Sal herself, Sal Grover, felt that she was making a stand for what she thought of a women's rights. And it is a clash of rights. And there's right and wrong on both sides here. And if we just could perhaps learn to be a little bit more forgiving of each other, in these very rare and extreme cases where the rights clash, most of the time we'd probably get along all right. But I don't know. I think we're addicted to argument, actually.
Yes, and I think it has to be fought so we're clear. I think, it's going to have to go to the High Court. And we're going to have to get something definitive so we all know where we stand and we all know what we can do. I love Sal Grover's comeback to Adam Bant, who's our Greens leader in Australia. He said, trans people exist. I agree. Trans people matter. I agree. Intersex people exist. Intersex people matter. I agree. They should be counted in the census. Now, because we've got a push at the moment to actually have a section to cover, that in the census. And Sal Grover said, if trans women are women, they're women on the census. That's what you wanted, kiddo. So I thought that was a stellar comeback. She's very clever. She's very clever.
I do think Australia is a particularly, it's an outlier on this issue in one respect. Most places, certainly in Britain, there's been a big divide on the left on this issue. And a lot of really well-established feminists and socialist campaigners have taken if you put crudely, the J.K. Rowling side of this argument, that we need to be a little anxious. And Hannah Barnes, I'm going to talk about her, I know, her book was praised by the likes of Emily Maitlis and Suzanne Moore. And if you know anything about British politics, these are great figures of the left or the liberal left in Britain. I think in Australia, and I do have a lot of Aussie friends, it's much more, if you're in the Murdoch press, you take this position, and if you're not, you take that. And I mean, I've tried myself, and I actually succeeded. I brought Hannah's book out and gave it to a couple of my mates, I probably shouldn't name, who you might regard as kind of Australian leftists. And prior to that, they'd taken a very dogmatic view that, trans women are women, anybody who raises any question is a phobe, J.K. Rowling's off her rocker, and all this stuff in the Tavistock is just scaremongering, a moral panic. But actually, having read Hannah's book, which was so influential here, I think a lot of them I got a couple of emails to say, do you know what, Phil, actually there is more to this than I'd realised. And I think that is the kind of thing that we need to do. We do need to build bridges. And I think that Hannah's book is particularly, did that really well in this country.
So Hannah Barnes actually appeared on Scandal Mongers episode number 70, if you want to look it up and see the interview, because it was really impactful, amazing. I listened to it again last night. And so tell everyone a little bit about Hannah Barnes's sort of background and how did you know her?
Well, actually, I didn't know Hannah particularly. I knew some of her friends. She was a BBC reporter. She worked at Newsnight. She was one of Britain's top investigative reporters. And I guess most people would have said she was, certainly not of the right. She was probably seen like maybe Four Corners reporters are seen in Australia. They'll tend to make a campaigning stand against the establishment. And, we perhaps expect that. Maybe we need that from campaigning journalists most of the time. But she took a real interest in the Tavistock because she began to be contacted. This was Britain's leading transgender clinic. I think probably the biggest in the world. And I mentioned earlier, a lot of the people who were talking to Hannah were themselves either gay or trans. They really believed in trans healthcare, as I do. But they were concerned that they had this wave of young people, especially girls, teenage girls, many from very troubled backgrounds, autistic, abused, self-harming, anorexia. And they had it was called rapid onset dysphoria. They had sort of got themselves into a mental place where they decided, oh, this is the solution to my problem. I must be trans. And the model that developed at the Tavistock was affirmation only, 99% affirmation, so that if you said you were, and you could perhaps get somebody else, maybe a friend, maybe an activist, to say you were, then you were. Whatever your parents said, whatever your own GP said. And so people were being put onto a conveyor belt, which led to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and often, radical surgery. And some people, Kiara Bell was the most famous, came out at the end of that process and said, do you know what? This wasn't right for me. I felt that I needed counseling. I needed people to ask me about the other problems, the comorbidities they're called, in my life. And Hannah learned more and more of these stories, and she made a couple of reports for BBC Newsnight. Then she tried to write a book. And guess what? It was really hard to get that book published. And this was a book, by the way, that was later praised on all sides of the House of Commons in London by politicians of all parties. But I think 27 people turned it down, and mostly because there were young people on there working in the publishing industry who just took that very dogmatic view. She's saying something against trans people. She's a phobe. This is evil. We can't have this. And there was a group called Mermaids, which was very influential. It's currently being investigated by the Charity Commission, but for many years it was really influential here. And a lot of its members took a strong view against Hannah. But she fought through it. She got her book published, and it was really balanced and fair. And it led, I think, directly to that as part of the movement that led to the Cass Review, which really transformed the way that many people look at this, not just in Britain. And she always made the point, this is not a left-right thing. This is about the care of children, best practice. Are we sure that this is the way to go? And is it really sensible to look at the safeguarding that doctors have always used, and also the way we journalists talk about suicide, and suddenly to say that is wrong, that is phobic. There was a big ITV drama here that was very influential when the trans moment was kind of really beginning, called Butterfly, and Mermaids were a big part of it. It was like based on the founder of Mermaids, and it looked at it now. It's so manipulative, Shauna. It's like, if you don't affirm this child, they will kill themselves. Do you want to have a live daughter or a dead son? Right. And the medical evidence for that, when you really dig into it, is so thin. And yet it became the absolutely dominant narrative. And that's what Hannah challenged. All the while saying she believes in trans people, she believes in trans healthcare, as did most of her witnesses. But she was simply saying, this has gone too far too fast. We need, especially with the young people, to take a slower approach and realize there are other things going on in their lives, perhaps, than they first present with. So that's Hannah's story.
Yeah, and I thought it was really impactful on Scandal Mongers when she made the sort of parallel between the fact that if you had cancer drugs that were, raising alarm bells with professionals and possibly causing real harm, that it would be shut down immediately.
Of course it would.
And yet, this took so long to actually garner any traction. So tell me,
because it became I won't say the word cult, but it became a club you could join that had fierce devotees and passionate feelings of enmity towards the enemy. And that's what kind of happens with a lot of these social issues. And then once you're in your side, anybody who says anything that even hints that the other side has some kind of point, well, you should listen, but often you don't.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you about it, because you don't have any fear about saying what you really think, which I think is very refreshing these days. I wanted to talk to you about Malcolm Clark. Now, he's your friend. How is he your friend?
Malcolm is a terrific British, Scottish science producer, long-standing gay rights campaigner, gay himself. I've known Malcolm for years, worked with him on numerous programs. And Malcolm started getting involved with the LGBT Alliance, which was a group formed between lesbian and gay people who were concerned about the more extreme end, if you like, of the trans agenda. They were dismissed as a hate group. They were vilified online. They were not allowed to go to most political conferences. Now, this was 4 or 5 years ago. It's all changed now. Even though some of the leading lights of, the old British gay and lesbian campaign joined their movement, the Mermaids, who I mentioned, took them to court, tried to have them banned from being a charity because he said they were a hate group, and they won that battle. And they also were a big part of blowing the whistle on the Tavistock, and so therefore connected to Hannah Barnes's book. I mean, it's funny, Malcolm was working, I think it was Malcolm's last boss in television. If you're listening to this, Malcolm, I forgive you for all those missed rough cuts. And all the times you said you needed a couple more days, and then I'd open Twitter and you'd written a 47-tweet thread. I thought, hang on a minute, where are this guy's priorities? But no, he is forgiven because he was brave. He was brave because to say those things 4 or 5 years ago was to risk career suicide. I mean, really, look at the story of Rachel Rooney, the children's writer, who wrote this sweet book, My Body Is Me, saying that we should tell our children that their bodies are fine. She was absolutely brutally cancelled. I mean, brutally. It's well worth looking her up online. And that was the atmosphere that Malcolm started his activism. So I think he was brave. Yes, and so I forgive him for those missed rough cuts. But they kind of won. They kind of won because they're now taken seriously. Yes. And, a lot of people say, well, they're not an extremist group. They were just people concerned that this thing is going too far, too fast. And that's really all this has ever been about, especially with regard to kids and the Tavistock. Yeah.
So Malcolm wrote a really interesting Substack that you actually sent me, and J.K. Rowling actually loved it too and gave him a shout out on X. It's about Sarah Kate Ellis, who took over America's most respected gay group, GLAAD, and turned it into, and this is a quote from Malcolm Clark, into a trans money-making machine. And so he basically exposes the fraud that Sarah Kate Ellis, is it allegedly? She hasn't been charged with anything, has she?
I think it's I wouldn't say fraud. I'd say the difference of opinion.
A difference of opinion, okay.
On priorities for her organisation.
Okay. Well, I'll give you a quote actually from Malcolm's article. The New York Times published an expose. The New York Times published this, an expose of the results of a major investigation that alleged misspending tantamount to fraud. Now, that's from the New York Times, I'm quoting. I'm not saying that. I'm just quoting. So it's interesting, though, because it was sort of this pattern of trans activists coming in and taking over very well-respected organisations, charitable organisations. And Malcolm Clark points out that then funds were being diverted in allegedly unseemly ways, in ways that did not benefit their members, did not benefit the causes that they were supposed to be representing. And so that's why his article is so incredibly powerful. What sort of fight back do you think will be coming his way over this issue?
Well, Malcolm has very thick skin. I don't suppose he's worried about any of that. I don't know much about the GLAAD issue. I must be honest. I read everything Malcolm writes. I think he has a good heart, and I think he has the interest of his community in mind and children in mind. I think what we saw with groups like Mermaids is that when activists get together with other activists and exclude all other opinion, it can be quite dangerous. And there's this thing called institutional capture. Now, that's certainly what happened at the Tavistock. In the Tavistock, individual cases were being decided not only on based on clinical facts or clinical advice, but on phone calls coming in from activists who had no medical training. They just believed in something. In this case, they believed in the affirmation model. And maybe something like that happened at GLAAD. But it's also interesting that the gay movement, took a lot of abuse. You mentioned Julia Gillard. I mean, it's not that long ago when I did a program on Priscilla, Queen of the Desert when I was at the ABC. Not many decades ago, people were being beaten up in the street, murdered just for being gay in Australia and elsewhere. So a lot of these people have come through a history of fighting prejudice. And so when trans comes along, it's natural, I think, for them to fit it into that paradigm. Oh, here's the latest one. And the people who are anxious or critical or the J.K. Rowlings, they're just the latest version of the prejudiced people we used to fight in the 80s or the 70s. And actually, I don't believe that to be true. I think it's much more nuanced and much more complicated. But it's easy, I think, if you're an activist, to fall into that mindset, which is why, there's a famous website called Turf is a Slur, which is J.K. Rowling links to it often. I mean, just thousands of the most violent and horrible things said about, feminists and lesbians who've tried to raise questions, just hit with this kind of horrific abuse. You're a Nazi, you're a fascist, and worse. I want to hurt you. I want to hurt you for saying these things.
Yes, I was surprised after my gossip before bed. Actually, all the ones that are held for review, all the comments, I thought, woo-wee. I wonder whether I would love to print them. I wanted to talk to you too about some comments about Malcolm Clark on X. There's a for and against. The against was, I personally would take everything he says on transgender issues with a gigantic pinch of salt. He's not a neutral or unbiased voice. And then counter to that, someone said, no, he's directing attention to the fact that charities have been redirected away from their purpose and are now causing great harm. He's entitled to be pissed off. So that's the counter. So again, there's always these two sides to everything, isn't there?
Absolutely.
And I've been following the fact that the Lesbian Action Group is actually in the tribunal as we speak for the Human Rights Commission, trying to get an exemption to the Sexual Discrimination Act so they can hold their meetings as they wish to. And an expert witness on behalf of the other side had a PhD in a subject that was completely unrelated to this issue. But she claimed in court that because she used the same methodology to achieve her PhD in an unrelated area, that she should be considered an expert on all areas because she can apply the same methodology. And
amazing. I think after this, since I have a degree in history, I might go and practice a bit of brain surgery. Or perhaps I'll split the atom in the kitchen.
Probably.
Really, it's crazy.
Now, on a lighter note, before we wrap up, I did notice on X that you posted a photo of a full English breakfast with your beautiful wife.
This is C, yes.
I've got a few questions to ask about that. Was that to share?
No, she's a greedy girl.
It's massive. It was absolutely massive. I thought you were going to have a romantic sort of meeting over breakfast.
Over a black pudding and a sausage.
Yeah. Now, do you really eat black pudding?
I do, actually.
Do you?
I come from the north of England, up north. It's regarded as a bit of a delicacy. Even though somebody said once to me, Phil, you realise this is just really basically eating a scab.
Oh, no.
Isn't that gross?
Oh, no.
I'm sorry to ruin your evening.
I hope no one's eating while we're... Well,
actually,
I eat meat, but I think that's just a step too far, that actual thing.
Oh, I don't know. I've seen a few things in Australia that I wouldn't want to put in my mouth.
Oh, really? Have you tried any of our local delicacies?
I tried camel once in the Northern Territories. That wasn't very nice.
Oh, did you? I haven't tried that. Have you tried witchetty grubs?
I haven't tried any witchetty grubs. My greatest Australian culinary memory was out in rural New South Wales. There was a barbecue in this pub and there was a blackboard, and obviously the menu had been up there for a long time. It was kind of faded. And the menu was steak, chicken, vegetarian option not available. I thought it was quite funny. Very Australian. But actually, I think if we're going to end this conversation on a note of levity, I read this wonderful thing. It does relate to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I had no idea who wrote it, but I agree wholeheartedly. We need more tolerance, this man said. The middle ground has become as alien to us as Mars. everybody, Tories, Muslims, young people, the elderly, migrants, hip hoppers, Jewish people, vegetarians, bacon enthusiasts, black pudding lovers, speed freaks, the fat, the fit, the timid, vicars, socialists. If we want to live as a happy country again, we've got to come together as one right now and gang up on those bloody cyclists. It's a moral for us all.
I think Jeremy Clarkson would applaud you for that. That's funny. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you will come back on again and we'll talk about other hard topics.
We will. I love these kind of conversations, and I really love engaging with you and your audience, Shauna. I have to say it's quite funny. I think there's a kind of dynamic now. I come on your program, I get quite a few new viewers, and then they watch me and then half of them leave again.
Yes, I'm sort of getting them used to you, Phil, because do you know what? We had an overwhelmingly positive reaction to our interview. So many people wanted you to come back on the show. So many people wanted to hear what you had to say because you just have such a depth of experience. And look, I don't want to be in an echo chamber. I want to hear alternative views and I'll argue with you if I disagree.
We love this that's why we love this media space that,
Yeah.
I remember I drop his name all the time, but Christopher Hitchens was a good friend. And he said to me once, this is when blogging just began. And long before there was social media or YouTube channels. Christopher said, do you know what, Phil? This is just an age which is created to answer the dreams of the unpublishable writer.
True.
Is that us?
True.
I hope it's not us.
Well, not you, because you're published.
Oh, that's true.
You're published. You've written so many wonderful books.
But it's definitely
not you. It certainly does apply to me, I would say. Well, thank you so much, and I'll see you again very soon.
Lovely to talk to you. Thanks for your time. Good night, Australia.
Bye.
Bye.